Jeff.
Hey. So how are you this evening?
I am exhausted.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had a big workout this morning with some of my triathlete friends, but that wasn't the exhausting part. I spent the whole afternoon working on the change log for my book that's coming out in September. And that was so difficult. It took so much concentration, like 4 hours worth of.
Oh yeah.
Like.
Well, I mean, is it, are you on some program that how's that working? I mean, what are you doing?
Well,
when you say change log.
Yeah. So the editor sends me this, like now the document is like 10 pages, 12 pages long, of things that, like he's talking about, what about the line break on this page, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And then there's all these little things that you have to, I need to stop recording right now.
All right. Well, hello, everybody. Glad y'all can make it tonight. So we're going to be discussing Kate Daniels' most recent book, which is actually a couple of years old, I think. But in the months of my son's recovery, I hope you're familiar with her work already. The White Wave came out years ago, the Niobe poems, 4 testimonies. Then she began to publish with LSU. Those books are by Pitt, but then 4 testimonies from LSU, and then A Walk in Victoria's Secret. So, well, let's get into a discussion of this book, which I don't want to give too much away, but like I'm blown away. Like I really, I just think this book is masterfully crafted from section to section, and maybe even more so than we've seen with. I mean, we've loved all the books, and they all have their kind of great qualities, but this book seems exceptionally tight, if that makes any sense to you. So what do y'all want to say about it? I've got pages of notes and snippets of things, but
her barbaric yacht really knocked me out. Man, the language, I was reading it to my husband and he was quoting it back to me. Some of her, it's so profound. What was interesting to me is the section about her son is the poems aren't as profound. They're, very accessible. You read them over, you got it. And it was like a page turner, that section. I mean, you're just like reading the page, turn the next page. You don't usually ever have that happen with poetry book. But then it was sort of sandwiched between these really profound sections, like I say, her barbaric yacht, and then going to Jefferson, walking through the Garden for Solace and going into Jefferson. That just knocked me out too. This is definitely my favorite of the books we've done. Just great language.
So often when I read really raw, visceral work, don't always have the craft that goes along with that. And here you have a real melding of both. The intense craft, as you say, so tightly crafted, and that visceralness of the body and of the experience, the mother, the child, the woman, all that. She just does a, as you said, masterful job of that.
I think it's my favorite of the books that
me too.
So far. And maybe part of it is the way she deals with aging that is so resonant. If you are aging, and the way she speaks about her son, there's several poems that particularly resonated. I've never had a child who was a drug addict, fortunately, but addiction does run in our family. And I found what she had to say just so revealing about how that has to be addressed and what it does to you.
When even if you haven't had a child with addiction, if you've had a child with any kind of issues, you're just strung over a chasm, and you know it's that same horrid feeling.
Yes.
She's so raw with her language and so bold. It almost, I mean, that first poem, I'm with you, Kathleen. That first poem just, I mean, by the time I finished it, I was like, I've got to take a break. This is so powerful. You have to kind of step back for a minute and collect yourself. It was just, it hit you so hard.
Yeah, I agree. I also think I'm always looking for a book that I can say is really put together artistically and purposefully. And this book, I mean, like masterful is the word, right? Beyond the poems themselves, which are wonderful, the way that it's put together is the naming of the sections, her, the addict's mother, him, us. I mean, that's just a level above of structure, how to do, you know, how to put a book together. And I felt like these poems, the placement of these poems were so purposeful, and you know, like everyone fit in its place exactly like it should. As
Yeah, I
far
would
as
love
this
yeah.
arc of this book worked so well for me.
Yeah.
I think
I'd love
better
for us to
than,
ask her about her process of putting the book
Yeah,
together.
Yeah.
yeah. So of all this book was, I'm always looking for that, you know, where's the complete package? This book worked for me in that manner. It was satisfying. The whole thing was satisfying to look at, to read, to know the structure.
Has anyone read the chapbook that was released before this one? Because I wonder if some of these poems were in it. You know, just how you go from, it would be a question to ask, how you go from having something like that. What did you learn from it? How did it impact the way you organize this? I can't remember if she was working on it, the two of them kind of together or not, but
From Bull City Press.
yes, yeah.
Yeah.
But I thought
the
that,
book,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's a smaller book, little chapbook.
yes, thank you, Jeff.
Well, yeah.
So part of these poems, this book was in a chapbook. Is that what you're saying?
I'm pretty sure, yeah.
Yeah, I actually don't have that. I don't have that little chapbook.
I don't either. I mean, I just
But I
read some
remember
of it. Yeah, I read some of it in workshop with her. But, you know, I think as someone who has been the mother with those same situations, has been someone who's needed to recover, I think that she really does, in a visceral way, but not an overwrought way, package that. I mean, you hear dog spelled backwards a lot in these circles, but I love the way she proceeded with the concept, you know, and I think two images that come out for me are the bouillon cube to describe addiction. And I think she talks about, I mean, it's in another poem that she talks about, you know, the West Virginia father running water that can be set to fire. Like these are just,
Yeah.
I mean, remarkable to me.
Yeah, the use of image throughout the book is really fascinating. In the barbaric y'all section, you begin with images of water, juice, sort of sexual image as well. Juice as a kind of addiction. Also, there are engines that thrum. There's the youth itself is motoring ahead, so to speak. But then later, when that image that you're talking about, Dana, comes along, even water can be, it's somehow corrupted. The blood, water, all the parts, everything that is addiction or can lead to addiction or can be corrupted is all through that image. I don't know if I was exactly clear about all that, but I was really, that particular moment in the book was just fantastic. I mean, there's so many things like that. There's so many masterful moments in this book. And maybe, something else to kind of throw into this mix, because I've heard, Kathleen, you've mentioned, the word yawp, and we've heard visceral and raw and all these types of terms. There's so many dichotomies, I think, that you can explore in this book. And of course, I mean, why begin with, the allusion to Whitman, sing the song of myself, but it's the song of myself, but it's the song of my son. It's the song of a family. On one level, it's a song of, of this addiction. And it's also like a scream, like yawp. I sound my barbaric yawp across the world, but it's also this kind of rage.
Well, and it's like animal. It's like an animal. And the description of giving birth, even the babies come out all slimy and mewling and just, and what really resonated for me was when the part thrilling her with ancient emotions that filtered through as if brand new. I mean, when you have a baby, you think, God, no, people have been doing this for years, but it sure feels like the first great deep time that's happened to any human, but just that ancient emotions that you tap into when you give birth to somebody. My husband liked the hefty handfuls of warm man parts under the covers.
Yeah.
He thought that was hysterical. We also liked the fact that the man was the necessary mind of math, but the woman was the full range of the arts and humanities.
Yeah. Well, there's the dichotomy,
And she throws humor in every once in a while like that just kind of catches you off guard because you've gotten so deep and intense in the content that all of a sudden there's a one-liner or just a little reference that kind of makes you go, wait, you're not prepared for it.
And I love that toward the end of the book, there's an upswing toward grace and unconditional love and hope and salvation.
Yeah.
Warmth and salvation and, belief again. And so she just does that beautifully. I love how she does that. It's like the last almost 10 poems or so. She moves toward that.
And even the last poem, Linda, the title is Yes.
Yes.
Affirmation, ending in an affirmation.
Right.
The last lines, the sun is on our shoulders in the graveyard, and it is hard not to exult in that warmth.
No, I love that. Love it. Yeah.
There's a poem, I can't remember who it's by, but Jeff, I bet you know. the one, the sunlight in the garden hardens and grows cold. We cannot frame the moment within our nets of gold. When all is told, we cannot beg for pardon. It's that poem remind, I can't think, it's a man wrote it. I forgot his name.
And then there's the incredible cover, incredible. And the doors opening, you know, the light coming through there, that little sliver of light at the end. But her head is so bowed. She's so heavy with something, you know, it's just such a gorgeous cover.
Mhm. It makes me think of the sort of solitariness of the mother, or the solitariness of the poet composing these poems. You know, well, I mean, I know we talked about, or we've mentioned the first section, the barbaric yawp. And I think it's on page 22. I mean, there's the barbaric yawp, and then the anorexia nervosa.
Yeah.
Those two poems make up that first section. And there was a few lines on page 22 which really caught my attention, which I love. I love this, the way that Kate is able to do extended poems. I know four quartets. She didn't write the four, but in four testimonies, you know, there are longer sections in that book, and this book has those as well. I'm always amazed by that. It's interesting that this is a totally different little sideline, but as I'm thinking of it, she has long poems, but she also talks about the miniature, you know, and things that are small, as the province, you know, mostly of women, but she herself in her own poems has done the other. But when she says, sometimes life is too large to even imagine what might be required to extract oneself from the master plot.
Yeah.
I thought those were beautiful lines. And I mean, this is not a graduate workshop. We're not trying to explicate things to the nth degree, but the implications of that seem very rich for this book. The idea of extricating plot, the master plot, the way a life turns out that may not be what one wants it to be. You know, the attention to books, which are throughout this book. Use your words, language, and the way language can help us grapple with and understand our situation. It all becomes part of the larger narrative. But sometimes life is too large to imagine what might be required to extract oneself from the master plot. I don't know. That's just rich to me.
Then the whole idea of detaching with love that the support groups always say, the counselors say, which is with your child, that's, you know, that's so hard to do. But it's
Well, Linda, and there are two poems. One is detachment with love, and then toward the very end, there's detachment.
oh, right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which is a beautiful, you know, kind of made thing unto itself, that smaller poem in the back.
Yes.
In fact, I think when this book came out, I snapshotted that poem and posted it probably on Facebook. There's 2 or 3 or 4 of the smaller poems I had done that with.
It has a Buddhist feel to me, like she's finally sitting within herself, finding some peace within herself. On page 38.
Yeah.
You find yourself a part of things in life that you don't necessarily like being a part of, but there you are and you can't change them. That happens so often, I think, with our children's lives. Um, and and we are a part of a master plot that we really can't get out of. And as she speaks to in detachment, you just have to sit in the center of the room and breathe. And I think she makes that point so clearly in a lot of what she writes. I was taken with the poem on page 49, Parental, where she talks about again, about the duality that is in people. And she says the two of them, being the good and the bad, were imprisoned inside. They sat there helpless during, well, this is about the parents. The two of them were imprisoned inside, talking about the phoenix coming out of the nest. Um, and they lay there crying every night inside that ring encircled by flame. They prayed for fires cleansing force. And then in that last line, she says, then in brand new form, the birds reborn, igniting by an unextinguished spark that survived the cooling embers. That was the thing that kept them going, the argument that they had about the single spark, whether to blow it out, to blow on it or stamp it out. And I've been through some things with my children and had wondered that same thing about, do you encourage the differences that you see could amount to something great or could totally ruin their lives. But she does that so well.
I was really taken by the poem 100% on page 35. That feeling like now it's broken and you can't ever reassemble the same. I liked the image there that she's playing with.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole shape of the poem, that's one thing I noticed too with her line breaks and the long and short lines, and there's a lot of different shapes of poetry in this book when you flip through it.
Mm-hmm.
I like that.
I noticed that in some of the poems, she began every line with a capital letter, whether it was the beginning of a sentence or not. And in other poems, she didn't do that.
Why do you think she did that?
I wonder.
Yeah, I don't know what dictates that choice, but that was one thing in the 100% that I saw, and I was like, oh, we would be told, no, don't do that,
I guess you get away with more when you're famous. But it did sometimes. It made me look twice at those lines that were all begun with a capital letter, and maybe go back and reread and see if there was something kind of hiding there that I didn't get at first.
To me, when you cap that first line, every first line, it has more of a formal feeling, to use that idea. And I found in my own work that when I'm writing more emotional things, it somehow helps me to order it more, like to do a sonnet or to do a pantoum or something, because it helps to shape that emotion outside of myself, gives it more of a formal shape, and gives me some distance to be able to write it. So I don't know if that has anything to do with it, but that's just my experience.
That'll be a question that we ask, because I'm really curious too. I noticed that too.
The first time I noticed it was in the sonnet that's in the, I think it's Anorexia Nervosa.
Yeah.
And I just think it brought my body into it because I felt a little off kilter sometimes when the capitalized word. I mean, I was looking ahead and thinking, I don't know. Let's see. Let me see. Yeah, I mean, there are just some of those you're not expecting. You're expecting something differently, or you think you're about through with a thought and you're taken somewhere else. And I think that's how, in the instances where she uses that, and she does it. I mean, that's the most formal, I think, passage that she has in the book. But I'm sure it was, I would love to have the answer to that too.
So probably one of my favorite poems in this book is on page 51, The Brothers.
Oh, yeah.
That poem, I think I cried when I read that poem. It just was, I don't know, Cain and Abel, the whole analogy to that, and knowing that brothers fight. Like I have 3 boys and they were always fighting, that's what boys do, brothers do. But the love that they have, and the part that, when someone told me how hard my 2 boys wept and how the snot poured down their faces and how entranced the others were by what they said and how beautifully they said it. That just is so, so moving and touching. That love there. It's just really beautiful. And its placement in this book is, once again, perfectly placed beside the poem Bikers, which are about her brothers.
Yeah. Well, as she says toward the bottom of 51, addiction is a family disease. And it's interesting that she takes even disease, breast cancer with her mother, that word, or the implications of that word, expand beyond just this particular addiction as a disease, but other diseases, and it kind of goes backwards in time, and takes in the sort of wider family beyond just simply her nuclear family, I guess. Is that the right one? So that's fascinating too. And then what family is. I mean, even the support group is a kind of larger family. History is this other larger family, which then gives us Jefferson. I mean, they're just, this is just a rich book to think about, which is, it's so cool in a way because it begins with this barbaric yelp, but so you got this visceral kind of yell kind of idea, but you also have this mind, and this mind that is working. Even like what's the daughter ask, mommy, what's my mind? And where's that poem?
Yeah.
Y'all remember that?
Yes.
Yeah, that's on page 21. Mommy, what is my mind? My daughter asked me when she was 3, strapped in her car seat, tapping her temple as I sometimes do when I'm writing a poem or trying to think. A kind of machine was what I said. You can use it to build things like ladders or cars. Of course, you can add to that narratives and histories and poems and understanding what we're going through. I mean the mind, and then the mind has its limits. It can't fully comprehend, it can't extricate itself from the master plot. it can't even understand the master plot. I don't know, it's just really rich. I mean, there are lots of things in this book about, attempting to comprehend or get a handle on something or come to terms with something. What it says on page 19, what are words for? Am I remembering this correctly? Yeah, what use are words when so many can't read, others won't, and almost no one cares anymore for carefully crafted utterance? We do. Sandy does. And we've got it. I mean, this is really crafted utterance.
I think too that I just kind of realized this, that the addiction is the great disruptor of the narrative. Throughout this book, it keeps popping in among these, these stories of family and the parents and the brothers and it. So on page 51 still, addiction is a family disease. It infects each member and distorts their stories. It lives to breach the boundaries of given texts and to change old narratives and destroy plots you thought were set in stone.
Yeah. Which is interesting. Well, on one level, isn't that fascinating that she begins the book the way that she does, with the body, with I mean, there's so many references in this that have to do with her own youthfulness, her own body, and the power of that body. And as we all know, it's like, okay, we've got this, we're young, we're virile, we're smoking hot, whatever. But it's suddenly something happens and we're no longer, okay, this thing got disrupted. I pull a muscle when I sneeze, we're no longer that thing. Remember the what's the poem where they're in a coffee shop or somewhere and there's a couple that are looking for a place to sit.
Yeah.
And one of them says, just they don't even see them.
That's a barbaric yacht.
Oh, is that in that?
Yeah.
Page 9. No.
Yeah.
It's the idea that you become invisible as you get, especially, so they say, older women, but I don't know.
It's not. I don't think that's the one on page 9 I'm thinking of. There's somebody there.
Not page 9, sorry. But
I know the one you're talking about, but I don't know where it is.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'll find it. But yeah, there's sort of dismissiveness of the youth and the youth of age is a part of this larger text too. Irrelevancy, page.
Yeah, page 14.
Is it 14?
Which one of those hags would pick up her broom and fly?
Yeah.
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 It's because we're old, Mona had said compassionately, gesturing at her own face as if to soften the blow to mine. They don't even see us anymore. Well, and even that line resonates outward too, because in a way, if one's own narrative gets changed, disrupted, then you're not really even seeing what you're seeing of yourself isn't even what you were. Well, I mean, there was a thought I had at one point in this, thinking about, maybe it was the poem Metaphorless, right? You'll know this poem a little later in the book. It's on page, well, no, it's actually in the middle section. Page 48, Metaphorless, that particular one. The dryness, dead center of deep pain. But as I was thinking about this, it got me to thinking about how, you think of metaphor as like getting across to something, and there's no way to get across. There's no way to get across to this other, there's no way to get across to understanding. There's no way to get across to the past this addiction, past this other life. But the parent, which one is vehicle and which is tenor? I guess that's my question. Is it is it my young self, the youth, and I interpret the older self through that lens, or is it vice versa? Is it the parent or the child? Which one is vehicle and which one is tenor? Is it the family or is it the individual? Is it before or after? Is it Cain or Abel? Which one is the lens through which we interpret the other one? Is it the barbaric Yawp or is it the mind? Am I saying anything? Does that make sense?
Mhm. Yeah.
And it's both. It goes back and forth.
Mhm. It could go both ways. Yeah, I agree with you. It can go both ways. It depends on who's doing the perceiving.
Oh, Linda, you're saying that reminds me that there are images in this book
Oh,
of
yeah.
of reversal,
Mhm.
of things going backwards. Is it the ferry that goes
I, I
the
know
engine
that.
roars in reverse on page 26.
Let's
Then the
see.
ferry backs up weakly,
Oh,
paralleling the dock. And I think later in the book there's another image like that too, where there's the reversal.
yeah. I can't remember which one though.
Then you've got the whole idea of bipolarity, bipolar, which we all have these ebbs and flows, but some more extreme than others. And you're right, she's just always playing with that through the whole book.
Oh,
Mhm.
Polarities.
page 15, trapped in the climacteric
Yeah.
six rains. Suddenly the seasons are flowing in reverse. Spring is returning to winter and she's unraveling backwards across time. The ankle socks and unshaved legs to unblood-stained panties and the box of napkins not yet needed. You know, is that the one you were talking about?
Well, it's an image that is similar to it's an image pattern, I guess is what I'm saying. Is there are lots of images of things going backwards. Motor reverses backwards.
But don't you think that's because in something like this, you're always thinking backwards and thinking there should have been a point when I knew there should have been something I could have done? Oh,
Yeah, and just wishing you could back up and reverse what has happened.
Well, there's the one poem, I think it's on page 33, where she says, molecules. Whether it's true or not that all our molecules replace themselves, that's the youth replaces age, and we're always being replaced. And our narratives get replaced by other narratives. His body seems halfway new again, 1 year into sobriety. I keep my distance now, but recall his painful 10-pound freight, the torpor of late-term pregnancy. All those final weeks I rested famished, calling for food I could spin into blood and bones so he could thrive. Even then, his cravings ruled us both. I mean, even desire, craving, there's probably a family of words that we could trace or find that all kind of come together with similar kind of implications throughout the book.
And something she does in this poem, which she does, I think, in others too, she goes from his craving the things that are going to give him life, you know, the physical things, the bodily physical things, into needing the things from the dresser drawers,
Mm.
the things that are going to bring him what he thinks he needs at that point, but that are totally different. The bank book and the string of pearls and that sort of thing. And she moves from one type of imagery to another in so many of the poems.
Kind of feel that distance that like, especially in that poem and the couple right after this, I think I see that in the 100% that I like too. It's like that difference between, you know, my child that needs things and takes things from my body to that child who is doing these horrible things. How can those two things
Mhm.
align? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really heartbreaking. It's
Yeah.
really heartbreaking to read. My kids are still young, but yeah, I can't imagine being in that place. But she illustrates it so well that
Mhm.
it makes you feel emotion, whether you've been there or not.
She seems to root everything in her body. I mean, her poems are very cerebral and sophisticated, but they're rooted in blood and bone.
Mhm. Which is interesting because also within the body is so much pleasure. And even I think it's the poem Detox, if I remember correctly, where it leads to giving up little pleasures, as if you almost can't let. Well, there's been maybe in some ways a celebration of bodily pleasure earlier in the book, but how much life do you give to that, and then does it take over? Does it take over in the next generation or in the offspring?
Yeah.
Another one that does a kind of reversal is the beauty.
Yeah,
Ninety-
page 96.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Beauty is magnetic until the poles reverse and all that energy backs up and forces itself in the opposite direction. Mm.
And again, it struck me as being something that was looking at how you don't see things until something lights the match.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this is the poem that has that image in it, doesn't it? That online video of West Virginia man whose county has been fracked. How beautiful the drinking water is tumbling from his kitchen tap. You can't even see the methane pouring down, concealed inside the stream and then, well, that idea of inside is resonant throughout the book too, but until he strikes a wooden match and douses it inside the flow. There's that word, flow, energy, blood, milk. Wow. There's so much good stuff in this that is masterfully put together. Um, well, hey, before we've got about 15 minutes before Kate pops in. But just in terms of the 4 sections, I know we talked a little bit about the barbaric yawp section, and then section 2. Oh, I guess one of my questions for Kate, or maybe for the rest of you, is the role of epigraphs. There are several epigraphs within this book, and I'm just kind of curious about that. How they too become a lens through which to interpret.
I thought they were very apt, or at least it seemed to me. Particularly the one for the addict's mother, with what exactly would you expect to frighten me?
Yeah, and she uses them, of course, for each section, but then there's several poems that start with them too. It's a lot.
Well, I thought that it was really important when she, the punch bowl analogy, for example, quoting Liam Rector's writings on the chalkboard, which he did for every class. And if you didn't know Liam, those were 2 very important things to know about him, because they set the framework for who he was and who he presented himself to be. And I think that they really were the lens by which you needed to read that poem. And I think that's what a good epigraph does.
Yeah. I'm just now having this thought, Claudia, that in a way, an epigraph it gives one an easy way to allude to some other text, some other poet. And within this book, not just within the epigraphs, but she alludes to Robert Haas's meditation at Luganatus. Is that how you say that? That poem title. All the old thinking is about loss. As she quotes that, but then later in the book, she also kind of revises that idea, I think. So, you can place an epigraph at the beginning of a section or below the title of a poem, and it already serves as an allusion. It gives us a framework to interpret, but also the poems internally. You've got Gertrude Stein in another poem, Bob Haas in another poem. Dickinson, some madness is divinest sense. She has that on page 20.
And that's a way of calling out to your elders, to those that came before you, to your family for the narrative.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of ways you can use that.
You can think about
she
that.
did that very well.
It's interesting that for the Dickinson, she uses that because she could have picked anything from Dickinson, right? But that's a really interesting choice. But I think, of course, as much as I love this book, and I've loved Kate's work for years. The section on Thomas Jefferson, which is also full of epigraphs, and I teach Jefferson in my American Lit class. And there's one of the passages here that I've read many times to my students. But that section, I just think that is such a profoundly good thing to include in this book. In ways I don't even know if I completely have a way of wrapping my own mind around, but it just seems, yes, this is so good. of course you would have to do this. Bring this in. Do y'all have any thoughts on that particular section? I mean, obviously it's, it gives us the title of the book, right? Reading a biography of Thomas Jefferson in the months of my son's recovery.
It's like her reading of this work during that time helped her not make sense of it, but because she talks about all of his contradictions, Jefferson's contradictions, and that's what she's living with, is not only her own body's contradictions in aging, but her son's, and how he grew to have his illness and all that. It seems to me like the fulcrum of the book.
Mhm.
And it's just a real tour de force poem. It's amazing. It's an amazing.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah, as she says toward the end of page 65, because of all this, I return thanks to Thomas Jefferson for his flawed example of human greatness.
Mhm. Yeah, and what she writes, what she quotes from Jefferson on 66, well, or doesn't quote, but what she says on 66 and then the page on 67 is so obvious, where she's drawing that parallel there between Jefferson's two-mindedness and her son's, and how it came down to him through the generations.
The way she weaves this is so brilliant.
It's brilliant.
So well. At first, when I read the title, I was like, okay. And then as I got into it, I just kept getting more and more pulled in, because I too teach Jefferson in American Lit. So, it's like,
Yeah.
I was really drawn into how is this going to work? But it worked so well.
It's one of the most painful books I've ever read.
Yeah.
Is it the third section of that poem? Before he was my son, he was contained, on page 67.
Yeah.
Within a clutch of dangling eggs that waited, even that image of eggs, and I mean that's already in the book, somewhere else.
Yeah.
All a tremble, and then the two minds in this kind of middle section of this page, and then the very last stanza of that on that page, it says, "We marveled at him in his bassinet, such an unsoothable infant, so unreconciled to breathing oxygen." It just, even the use of the word unreconciled, which we've already been taken through so much that we're trying to reconcile, or a mind is trying to reconcile. Wearing a diaper, waiting for milk, still small and manageable at first. Even that resonates backward to miniature, the manageable. She says on page it's in that first little section. Keeping things small on page 22, she says, keeping things small and manageable. That's one way I've kept breakdown at bay. But to go back to the bottom of 67, still small and manageable at first, but whirling moods, baby-sized and effervescent as the liminal clouds of early spring, stalked him. Even then, this thing stalked him, threatening his freedom and his right to self-rule. That made me emotional when I read it the first time. Just that, because there's, freedom, self-rule, democracy, all that kind of stuff with Jefferson is so amazingly encapsulated in those lines. And then to move from there to, we hold these truths to be self-evident. It's like, what are you doing, Kate? This is so good.
And then on page 73 in that poem, sometimes it helps to latch on to someone else's vision in a crisis, the way I did at Monticello so long ago.
Yeah.
It's like the reasoning of why these two go together is right there.
Yeah.
And the circling back and the reverse and back in time again.
Yeah.
And of course, latching on is a nursing term,
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
you know, latching on. Yeah.
Yeah. It throws me back to the word that Alice mentioned, which I had jotted down for myself anyway, that climacteric, which is a word that you come across, you're like, okay, I've got to look this up. But did y'all look up this word? I mean, maybe you already knew it, but it means a critical period or event. But it also has, as an adjective, means having far-reaching implications or results. So, I mean, I guess in that sense, I don't know if everything could be climacteric. But of course, reading this book for me is climacteric. I think it has far-reaching implications. And yeah, Sandy, when you brought this up about on page 73, sometimes it helps to latch on to someone else's vision in a crisis. It throws you back into the power of narrative, that particular poem, or the support group, listening to people's stories. There's the one, the woman with the cats or something. That how do you come back from that? Just the power of stories, listening to other people's stories. And then the very last section of that poem with Jefferson, I cannot live without books, he wrote. As I sit here in my 5,000 poetry collections room, what is it Robert Bly says in one of his poems? Friends, each day I crawl across the floor and kiss the books I love. Something like that. I cannot live without books, he wrote, and so gave permission for a kind of life previously unimaginable. This life I live now, soothing myself and seeking comprehension among my many volumes. I mean, as you know, what a great line.
Yeah.
Soothing myself and seeking comprehension. I mean, it seems like that's the project of the whole book in some sense.
Mhm. You know how we talked about how David Kirby and Matthew Lippman, their minds just went down circuitous routes and they followed them. This is to me feels the opposite of that. Everything adds up, everything flows, everything's tight, everything's so thought out.
Yeah.
And I loved what those guys did, but this feels like
There's control here. Sometimes they felt a little out of control to me, but
yeah,
control.
like
So
they were
here
just
she is, guys. I'm gonna
letting their mind do its own thing, whereas she's riding her mind. She's reining it in.
Yeah. Hey, Kate.
There she is.
Hey.
Hi, Kate.
Hi.
Welcome.
Hey. For having me.
We've just been oohing and awing.
Right.
We so enjoyed reading and discussing your book.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you for reading it. I appreciate it. So am I seeing everybody here in the group who's on the screen? So there's about
Yes,
12
I
or
believe
13.
you are.
Yeah. There are more that are in our book club, I guess, and some come, some months and don't others. And we actually got messages from several people who can't be here, but have also read the book. So I think we sold something like 180 copies.
Oh my gosh.
No, I'm just, I'm hopeful.
Like, she didn't buy that.
What is it that you want me to do?
Go ahead, Sandy.
Okay, so we had a few things that we brought up in our discussion that we'd love to ask you about. And I'm going to start with just kind of like a poetic form or choice about the capital letters on every line on some of these poems.
Did you all read In the Months? Is this the? or did
Yes,
you-
yes, in the months, yeah.
Okay, like, can you give me an example?
Let's see. The Addict's Mother birth story has all capitals. Every line starts with a capital letter.
3 syllables describing
100%.
addiction.
So you want to know why I did it on some and not on others?
Yeah.
Exactly, yes.
Well,
Or what does that choice mean to you?
it means that I have a more sort of formal feeling about the way the poem coheres or understands itself on the page, which may not even be apparent to other people. But there's something that feels, I'm so old that when I was studying poems in school and really pretty much all the way through college, virtually every poem I would read had a capital letter at the beginning of the line, so I started poems that way. I stopped doing it at some point, but it was hard to stop because it had become such an ingrained habit, even though I wasn't writing, formal verse. So that's what it means. It means that there's something about my sense of the poem that it's more of an object. I think it also psychologically, it means that it distances me from the poem in a way. And that these poems, you understand some of them, were really hard, really wrenching to write. And so I had to figure out ways to get away from them so they wouldn't sort of burn me up as I was writing them. So I think that was probably one of the uses of those capital letters. And also sometimes I just like the way capital letters look on. That's what I always tell my students, we're those weird people who not only do we sit around amusing ourselves by moving words around in our heads, but we can spend an incredible amount of time wondering whether we should use a comma or a semicolon here, or a lowercase. So part of that too.
Yeah, well, we had it right then that we were talking about the formality of that choice may feel like a more formal choice.
Mhm.
So, did you have input in the cover?
Yeah, I chose the cover.
Ah,
Good
great.
choice.
Yeah, we love that.
I knew that, so all my other books that preceded this had very, except for the one on this one on addiction, I used this cover too, but all the rest of them had very bland covers, sort of color bands, things like that, no art on them. And I really wanted to have a book that had art on the cover. So LSU said, sure, we can do that. Find us something that you want. So I knew that I wanted a woman on the cover. I wanted her to look sort of, hyper autonomous, really maybe sort of solipsistic, really enclosed in herself and onto herself. And then I thought, originally the book was going to be called Reading a Biography in the Months of My Son's Recovery, and LSU would not let me title it that because it was too long, and they said it wouldn't market well and it wouldn't show up on the cover. But I wanted to have a woman reading a book. So I actually went to Google Image and did a search, painting woman reading book. And it was astonishing. Hundreds of images came up, maybe even thousands, 200s. And then I found this guy. And this was his wife. He was an early 20th century Danish painter, Wilhelm, or I'm probably saying it wrong, Wilhelm Hammershøi. And this is his wife, and this was their apartment. And he painted dozens and dozens of scenes of her in various rooms in the apartment. And this one I just thought perfectly expressed a feeling that I had about the book, that it was dark, that it was serious, that there was a lot of uncertainty and sadness in the book, but there's also sort of this light 3 rooms in, so there's kind of hope in it. And she seems to be reading. She's got a book there on the table next.
Yeah, we love that.
Yeah, thanks. I do too.
And one thing that, Kate, that we are really kind of super impressed by is the 4 sections and the way in which all of these just feel so purposeful, as if a larger text or a larger argument is unfolding all the way through. Um, and I don't know what to ask about that, except, I guess I'm kind of curious, like, how do you create these poems that have these sections, like in her barbaric yawp? Is that assembled over time, or do you go through one rotting of that where everything ends up in it, or do you come back and shift things around, or you gathered together disparate things that were written over time and, oh, these all fit together? I guess I'm kind of curious about those long, because you've had a history of writing poems in sections or longer poems, even though you say that the miniature is usually the woman in this in that poem.
Yeah, I don't have disparate parts and fragments that I write and then sort of one day go, oh, they connect with something else. I typically have some kind of a not an idea, because I don't write poems from ideas, and I don't really think poems come from ideas, but I have some sense of the poem, or often I might have a character. Often I'm a relentlessly narrative poet, so
Yeah.
story. And I'm a really, really slow writer. And but these poems came in different ways. Her Barbaric Yacht was a poem that came out fairly quickly. I mean, I don't remember how long it took me, even with revisions, maybe 2 or 3 months, something like that. And it came from an actual, and I'll tell you what it was. If you, I sometimes tell this story with adult audiences at readings. So some of you may have heard me say it before, but I went to look at an apartment when I was a college student at UVA that I was thinking of renting with a bunch of friends, and it was in the 1970s, and it was at the height of second wave feminism, and I was this, like second wave feminist, and I wore jeans and no bra, and I didn't shave my legs or my armpits, and I read Adrienne Rich and all that stuff, the stereotypical stuff of the 1970s. I thought I was so incredibly liberated. And I go into this old house, this apartment on the top floor of it that we're going to rent. There's 4 women, and we're all looking at the rooms we want. And I walk into the room, and it's occupied at that point by this woman whose name was Gretchen. And I'm looking around. It's a great room. I'm thinking, yeah, I can live here. And then over in the corner on the floor, I see a diaphragm, and it's used. It's like it's just been, flung out and thrown on the floor. And it was stunning to me. And I realized at that moment, I am definitely, compared to this woman, I'm not liberated. Like I had a diaphragm, but it was in this little like case and like always closed up in the drawer next to the bed. And so for years, I thought about this as this sort of emblem of a certain kind of consciousness raising that I came into accidentally. And I always wanted to write about it, but I didn't know how to. So this entire poem came just from that image, trying to understand something about what would be the forces that would create a young woman like that? What would be the forces against a young woman like that? And that's where it came from. So that one came really fast. And I also knew I wanted to write a poem that had the title Her Barbaric Yacht, from. Yeah. But others of them took longer, like the Anorexia Nervosa poem. I worked on that for years and years and years. Yeah, I've taught college for 40 years, and every single place I've taught, eating disorders have been a profound health problem with young women. And, it's heartrending. And so I never suffered from it myself, but I wanted to write about it, but I couldn't figure out how I wanted to. So that one, I probably wrote that on that poem for 10 years. A piece there. So in different ways they come. The Thomas Jefferson poem was actually commissioned for a volume that Lisa Russ Spar edited a few years ago, poems about Monticello. And so I wrote that over the course of about I think at about 14 months it took me altogether, but I was always working, just on that poem. So different ways.
Yeah.
But I love long poems. I love them.
Well, it's almost as though, because well, this book has long poems and individual poems and sections, and then the second section and the fourth section are made up of individual poems for the most part. But even the barbaric yawp section, if I remember correctly, has 3 poems, but they all, because they're together, almost seem like part of a larger. I mean, they're part of a section that makes sense, but they also seem as if they just perfectly fit together. I mean, you would move from the anorexia poem to the Franco, homage to Frank O'Hara, and it seems like it just seems designed. Of course, you would go from there to there.
Well, it was designed. I
Yeah.
mean, there are other poems that didn't get in, but I did. Each section has an idea. Each section has an idea. Once the poems are
Mhm.
written, in terms of how I organize them and put them together, each one does have a kind of central focus or central idea.
Well, Kate, about the Thomas Jefferson poem, I know you said it was commissioned. Did you truly visit Monticello and get inspiration from, like visiting his home, Thomas Jefferson's home, or?
Well, I'm from Virginia, so I've been there many, many times. The instance that the poem refers to, and I went to the University of Virginia as an undergraduate. I was part of the second class of girls that was allowed to matriculate there. And I was the first person in my family to go to college. It was a really big deal for me to go to college. Yeah, Monticello was quite an inspiration to me. And I periodically visited. I visited it the last time I was in Charlottesville, which was the spring of 2019. I go there almost always when I go, and it's been interesting over the course of 50 years to watch the ways in which that place as an institution and as a historic memorial, memorial site, I guess you could say, has developed and grown. Up until the 1990s, Monticello very much resisted the narrative that Thomas Jefferson had Sally Hemings, his enslaved person, as as a lover, and that he had children with her, and they had to change. I mean, the narrative had to give way to reveal the truth, and as the narrative changed, the place changed. So when I first went there in the 1970s, there was no reference to enslaved people. There's the whole Mulberry Row, which is a reconstruction of where all the slave quarters were and where all the the working parts of Monticello, which was a plantation, was, but none of it was there then. So it's he's one of our historical figures who is being reconsidered and reevaluated for a lot of things that he wrote and ways that he articulated his very complicated beliefs. So, yeah.
Well, the addition of that poem, I don't know, maybe it's one of my favorite parts of the book, just because he inhabits the dualities that are also part of the other sections of the book, or at least the idea of a duality, and the enslavement, addiction, not that those are identical, but enslavement, freedom, self-rule, those types of things that are mentioned in the poem are elsewhere in the book. So that's who was it? Linda, maybe you said tour de force. I think it was you. So that's hard to disagree with. The tour de force poem, among others.
My child who struggled with addiction, as I may or may not be clear from these poems, I'm never clear, but the situation was one of dual diagnosis, co-occurring mental illness and addiction, right? They occur at the same time. And when I set out to write the poem, in the month, reading a biography of Thomas Jefferson, the months by, at first it was just reading a biography of Thomas Jefferson, and I was actually writing the poem in the real time of the first few months when it became clear, evident to my family that my child was in serious trouble. And so at first it was just a poem about Thomas Jefferson and Monticello and my experience of visiting Monticello, blah, 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 blah. You know, me as a first generation college student. But those months, which actually, you know, turned into about 2 years, were so, they took over everything. I mean, they completely took over the narrative of my life. They infiltrated everything. And so that entered the poem. So every time I would be working on the poem, I couldn't just restrict it to Thomas Jefferson and Monticello. This kept coming in. And at some point I realized what you're talking about, Jeff, the kind of the duality of Jefferson's mind, which is so disturbing. How did the writer of that, the Declaration of Independence, that incredibly beautiful, extraordinary, iconic language, you know, how did that person own slaves? How did that person beget children with an enslaved person he owned? How is that even possible? And that somehow got, you know, brought together with the whole notion of dual diagnosis and what was going on with my child. Yeah.
Kate, this is the most painful book I've ever read.
Oh,
And I don't have really any right to ask, but is he better?
yes, my child's in recovery. Yeah, not a child anymore. Thank God. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for asking. And when I give readings, I read the poems. You know, I always start by saying that before I sent this manuscript off to LSU, I sent it to actually everyone in my family, but particularly that family member, and said, you know, read the poems and let me know if there's anything you want me to take out, if there's anything you want me to change, anything that you object to. And he actually said to me, gave me permission to publish them all, and said, he said this wonderful thing to me. He said, I actually think of myself as your co-author.
Oh.
So that was quite a wonderful thing. Yeah, I mean,
The Phoenix worked. The Phoenix metaphor worked.
the what?
The Phoenix metaphor in parental.
You're crackling in and out, so I can't.
In
That's a
parental.
Phoenix
Oh.
metaphor.
Yeah.
The Phoenix metaphor in parental.
Oh,
You're talking-
Yes.
yeah. Are you asking me a question or just comment?
I was just saying it worked.
Yeah, that was a hard poem to write, I have to say. When I do a lot of work in what we call health humanities, and I go out and do a lot of presentations, and I talk about the use of narrative therapies in helping people stay in recovery. I teach workshops for the porch and writing for recovery. And one of the reasons this is so important to me is that, you know, addiction is it's so many things, but it's in many ways, I think, continues to be sensationalized and stereotyped in the press and in media depictions, in all kinds of depictions. And the fact is that, you know, most people somehow or other find their way to recovery. And most people who actually do recover do it pretty much on their own. You know, most people can't afford $30,000 a month for treatment, or they don't have health insurance, or they can't wait 2 or 3 months on a wait list to get into a free treatment center. But the narrative out there is that you're doomed. This addiction is doomed, and it feels like doom when you're going through it. As you know, well, I guess yourself. I don't know about that, but if you're in relation to someone, but part of my sort of, you know, public health message, I guess, is that, you know, people can and do recover. Not everyone succumbs in a fatal way to this. And I, when this struck my family, I was basically catatonic for months. I could barely breathe. I lost 40 pounds in 6 months. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. A friend took me to Al-Anon, and that helped me enormously. But at some point, about 9 months into this, I was talking to a friend on the phone, who's very different from me. She's a judge she's a state judge in another state. She's very rational. She's not, you know, an over emotional, you know, too subjective poet like I am, maybe like some of you all are. And I was telling her about this. She'd known my child from infancy, and she knows a lot about addiction because up in Massachusetts where she is, it's been very bad for decades now. And she said, look, I'm going to say this thing to you, and you need to hear what I'm saying. I hear that you're terrified, and you think that, you know, he might die or he's going to destroy his life, but you need to know that people can recover, and people do recover, and people are recovering. And it was like someone just threw me a life raft, and that changed everything. And it made me able to write these poems, really. So that's part of, you know, what I do. I hope that they don't sensationalize or glamorize in any way any aspect of this, because there's nothing glamorous about it. It is pure, raw, unmitigating pain and hard work. But, you know, people get through it.
Well, let me ask you one more question, and then we'd love it if you would read a poem to us about epigraphs.
Huh?
That there's a lot in the book, and I guess we were wondering, do you start with that, or do you write the poem and then find something to fit it, or like how do you go about choosing those, and how do you see them working?
I love epigraphs. I know that a lot of y'all know Tiana Clark, who was my student at Vanderbilt, and she wrote her thesis at Vanderbilt with me, and she shares my love of epigraphs. So, but she went overboard. You know, we had to like weed epigraphs out of the thesis, but I just loved them. I can't figure out why I love them so much, but there's something about the kind of, well, maybe I do know. There's something interrogative about epigraphs. They come in at a kind of an oblique angle against a text, and they can comment on what you're doing, or they can open it up. They can create a tension that works against it. I just love them. They're really dynamic elements of poems for me. Some people really don't like them, but I really do like them. I knew that I wanted to have a poem that used that gendered barbaric yop in the feminine gender, and so that, for instance, you know, that was a gimme there. I can't say about the others. I think there were poems in here in which I took epigraphs out, but you know, well, here's one I just opened randomly to Plain Style Ars Poetica that has that Gertrude Stein epigraph. Out of selection comes painful cattle. Now, I'm not particularly a Gertrude Stein fan, but I was teaching some Gertrude Stein, so I had to read this from Tender Buttons, if I remember correctly. And I was reading it, and I came on that line during this period, and it was like an electric shock. It was like, this is what I'm writing about, and all these poems about addiction. I'm writing about out of selection comes painful cattle. I've got to get this in here somewhere. So that's sort of, you know, the way that I think it works for me. But I really love them.
Yeah, we think they work wonderfully in the book.
I got a book that's coming out, sort of a prose book in January, called Slow Fuse of the Possible, on poetry and psychoanalysis. And Emily Dickinson is all throughout the book, and there's all these epigraphs. It's in like 28 chapters, and each chapter has an epigraph, and the foreword has and you wouldn't what a pain it was I had to get permission for every single epigraph that was used. It's unbelievably complicated and can be expensive to get permission to use these epigraphs.
Well, I don't know what poem we'll ask Kate to read, but I just want to, I guess, go on record and make a comment about it's a poem we did not talk about in the group, but there's one called the diving platform, and which I just thought the inclusion of that at the moment it arrives was just perfect, and the implications of that poem for me resonate throughout the book. I just I would throw that in the mix as a possible read. It's just somebody else may have something else, but
Glad to read that one because I don't want to read a downer of a poem at the very end, right? You can read the downer poems at the beginning of the session, but you can't read for the final one. And I haven't read this one in a while. This
and
actually,
I'm not necessarily asking you. I just wanted to make a comment that poem really, well, in the sense that it like swimming out and getting a respite and being over this massive, I mean, the metaphor of this just seems so wonderful for this book. Such a good poem.
well, I mean, this last poem was, a lot of poems about marriage and marriage over the long haul, and, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But this may take the magic out of this poem for you, Jeff. But again, this came very much from real life. This was a couple, a married couple, a long married couple. They've probably been married over 30 years by the time I met them at a writers conference called the Glen Workshop that was run by Image Magazine. It used to be run in New Mexico. And they were both artists. She was a painter. He was a painter and he's a sculptor. And they, as I said, they'd been married for a long time. And they were very committed to each other by the time they got married. And at the wedding, he just had a complete and total, I guess sort of panic, runaway bride panic attack type of thing, and became, which I gather is common. I didn't have that, so I don't know, but I guess that this is something that happens to people. And he thought he wasn't going to be able to go through with it. So he went down to take a swim to sort of cool himself off. I don't know if there was a diving platform. I made up the diving platform. That was kind of a metaphor, but he got out into the water and somehow was looking back and he could see her. And there was something about the distance and the detachment that he said allowed him to calm himself and realize that he was doing the right thing, that he wanted to make this commitment to her. And then the stuff about the help and the me, I'm from the South. I grew up going to Southern weddings. Maybe they do this in other parts of the country, but I mean, I've been to weddings where people have done exactly that thing, right? Help me on the groom's shoes.
Yeah.
That's how that came. But anyway, I'd be glad to read that one. And thank you all for reading my book and for talking about it. It's lovely to see people here. Some people I know. Dana, I haven't seen you cut your hair since the last time I saw you. Alice, I haven't seen you in a long time. So it's just, thank you so much. I'm always grateful when people read and respond to my poems. This is called The Diving Platform. Halfway across the lake's dark span, the diving platform glittered, somehow suspended on the surface of the water, somehow tethered in the depths. It looked like an ice cube, he thought, in a giant's mug of poison broth. It looked like a tablet of aspirin, as yet undissolved in a sick man's gut. It looked like a sturdy crust of cooked onions, caramelized on the cooling surface of a bowl of soup. And it looked like a scab, a monstrous healing, overgrowing a wound that should have been sutured, but was left instead to heal messily all on its own. If he started now, he could reach it before he had to dress for the ceremony, before he had to free the rented finery from its cloudy shroud of plastic sheets and fit it to his body, tightening the blood-hued cummerbund around his waist and clicking studs and cufflinks securely into place at neck and wrists, before he had to scrub the unworn soles of the black dress shoes to remove the words his brother had chalked, help on left and me on right. So when he knelt beside her to receive the blessing, no one would know how he really felt. For generations, her family had farmed there, in the fields watered by the pond, the diving platform anchored in. And not one of those persevering men could say exactly how far down it was, how many murky feet of water before he touched the bottom. So when he saw her there, all the way over on the other side of the lake, dropping her towel and striding straight into the water and shallow diving in and striking out for the platform in the middle, he understood how it would be, that he would swim out too and meet her there, and they would sit together on the platform, anchored in the deep, cold water for a while, just keeping company, drying in the sun.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, thank you so much, Kate, for joining us. We really appreciate it. I think we're putting this on pretty maybe the top of our favorite books now.
I appreciate it. I love it. Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
We're conferring upon it an after the fact Pulitzer Prize. So
Thank you, Kate, so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, that was lovely.
yeah,
Yes.
I do think that poem though it's so interesting in this book. It almost looks like a poem that wouldn't be in the book, except its presence in the book seems so rich in implications for everything else. You know, if you think of that depth somehow anchored to something, and then this respite that you get to out in the middle of it. I don't know, the detachment. She used the word detachment. We were talking about that. I think there's a lot of purpose in that poem that might not otherwise. Well, that's what I love about a collection of poems, right? Is that when you put things side by side or within the same frame, the meaning of something takes on a different meaning because of the resonance.
And it's a leap of faith too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I thought it was her parents, the two people.
Mm.
I find it interesting how she's written some of these poems, you know, pre and post and during, and yet they all meld together so beautifully in this book when they're from different times. They seem like they were all written, you know, for the book, but they weren't.
It was a great
Maybe
discussion.
something was working, you know, maybe something was working in the universe to make the pieces into the whole.
He had a book that came out about a year before this. It's much shorter. Oh, it's got, but a lot of the poems there go into, in fact, I think all of them may go into the sections that are here. But the sections that are in this book are more developed.
Yeah.
That's the chat book, I guess, that we were talking about earlier.
Yes, the little chat book.
3 syllables describing addiction.
Mm.
Yeah.
Ah. All right. Well, I guess that we're finished for the evening. Thank you guys for joining us. Next month, and once again, I don't have the book with me. Do you have it?
I don't.
Okay. It's called Bring Now the Angels by Dilruba Ahmed. And I'll post it on the Facebook group. So we will, and then we have to pick some more books.
We haven't done that yet, but we'll. Well, I mean, Yeah, we'll come up with some good ones, I hope.
Yeah.
There's always a good poetry book coming out. So
Have you read Tiana Clark's latest book? Have you already discussed hers?
we haven't discussed that book, but
The one, her second book. Yeah.
Yeah,
talking about-
that one right there. Yeah.
yeah, this is masterful. I read a lot of this before it was published. That's a well-made book too.
And that was what, a 2019?
2018.
2018?
So talk about, I can't talk about the trees without the blood. So, that actually becomes the section titles. I can't talk. That's one section title. Another section title is about the trees. And then without the blood is a section title. And then there's an epilogue at the end. But
Wow.
and I think Kate's the one who came up with that frame of like taking those parts of that title and making them the section titles.
Very cool.
I'd love to read that for our group.
Let's do that.
That'd be great.
I've been looking for an excuse to buy it.
Yeah, yeah.
We'll put that on the list. I don't object, but I love Tiana. I wrote a letter of recommendation for her to get in graduate school, and at Vanderbilt, I cried. I cried when I wrote the letter. I cried when she got in.
Oh,
I
she
cried
just got a major travel grant.
the Amy Lowell
Amy Lowell.
traveling.
Yes, yeah. Really excited.
All right. Well, we will call it a night, and then we'll get back to everybody about the next books, and I'll post a photo of the April's book.
Yeah.
And hopefully we can get Del Ruba to join us. We'll see about that.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Good night, everybody.
Take care.
Thank
Good night.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye. Take care.